Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Angela Puca and welcome to the livestream symposium. And today we have a very special guest. First of all, thank you all for everybody in the chat. I can see that some of you guys are here, and thank you, Andrew and Edward, for moderating the chat. Today we are going to talk about something that is very difficult to find in English, I would say, and that is the Roman Reconstructivist movement. And we have a special guest, Marco Castagnetto, a PhD candidate at the University of Turin and fellow metalhead, as we were discussing just before the live in private. So thank you so much for gifting us your knowledge, because this is also the topic of your PhD, isn't it, Marco?
Thank you very much, Angela. It's very nice to be here. And most of all, it's very nice to find some kind of interest in this topic, because it's a kind of neglected knowledge in the academy. And so I think that this is really a nice chance to share some ideas about Roman traditionalism, as I call it. And so thank you very much.
Thank you for being here. Another thing that I was thinking about is that now my audience will think that all Italian scholars are named Marco, because I've had a few Marcos.
Yeah, probably it is.
How are you today, Marco?
I'm very fine, and I think that today is a very cloudy day here in Turin.
Well, I live in England, so
okay. You're quite used to this kind of climate, and no surprise for me to find that kind of climate. So,
but coming from Naples, Naples is very different.
Yeah, I know. No, I've been many times in here. It's a city I love. I really love, and I've been there also because it's a city that has very interesting things about traditionalism and the history of Italian esotericism in the 20th century.
Yeah, so let's crack on. And before we do, actually, I'd like to remind everybody in the chat, if you have a question, just super chat it so that I can put it on screen and Marco can answer it. So Marco, let's talk about the Roman Reconstructivist movement then. Let's start with the history. When does it start, and are the key moments?
Yeah, in a very preliminary way, we could define more properly, I think, Roman Reconstructionism as Roman traditionalism. And I would like to better specify this distinction. As we all know, there is a wide debate in the academy about the distinction between emics and ethics perspectives and the ways in which these two approaches can influence and even shape studies of religious or magical movements. Here, the Roman case is exactly a paradigmatic example of how the definition that commonly used by the scholars, that is, of the so-called pagan studies, the definition used to define this particular field, and is namely that of Roman Reconstructivism, is very unpleasant to practitioners themselves. Why? Certainly, the Roman case is not the only one, because there are many phenomena of contemporary paganism that reject the definition for different reasons. But the modern revival of the ancient Roman religion has some specific features that show us how the broad framework of pagan studies is a kind of label to which we can recognize an introductory validity, but within which there are irreconcilable and sometimes even antithetical differences. So let's go a little deeper into the problem of definition that I think that is a kind of pivotal problem. A definition that could probably better meet the favor of practitioner is that of the Roman way to the gods. That is more or less the way they call their own beliefs and practices. The word way has a complex of semantic values that contain at least three complementary perspectives. So first of all, it is a modus, which is to say a lifestyle, so that it preserves in some way a fundamental feature of the way traditional societies related to the sacred. That is, that which does not provide for a distinction between the different spheres. To put it better, the social, political, economic, and obviously religious life of traditional society is not divided into a kind of autonomous or separate spheres, but it's kind of a holistic whole whose fields interact, so they act on each other and then distribute the effect on all levels, on all planes. As doing so, relating on a conception of life that provides for a pact between men and gods. And they see this pact as a guarantee of the preservation of the cosmic order and to preserve the life of civilization, of Roman civilization itself. So thus, the second aspect is that the definition of the Roman way to the gods as a relational feature and also a sense of movement that highlights in some way the chance and a type of relationship. So the chance is to set up a journey toward the gods, while the relationship is that of a more intimate reciprocity. This way of understanding religious life takes on a deeper meaning in a nation such as Italy, where Christian ontology, the whole Christian ontology, has exercised a kind of monopoly for an incredibly long period of time. And finally, the term Roman way implies the chance of other that are potentially infinite ways. And this, I think, is a kind of homage to the mentality, to the way of thinking of pagan authors who responded to the Christian Polemist literature, in which they saw an incomprehensible exclusivism that legitimized only one way of relating to the sacred, that is precisely that of the new Christian religion. I think it should also be noted that practitioners of the Roman way to the gods understand tradition in what they call an eminent sense, which is to say tradition with a capital T. Yeah. To distinguish from a different way to intend tradition, that is the transmission of customs from one generation to another, from father to the son. It's quite interesting to point out that this vision of tradition can be the motivation also, can motivate the interest of many traditionalists in Hindu-European studies. The concept, for example, the concept of Sanatana Dharma, with which the Hindu tradition refer to the doctrinal basis of what we wrongly call Hinduism, is very much seen in the sense Roman traditionalist circles are used to portray their belief. That is a sort of perennial norm that is perennial precisely because it has a kind of scientific value, representing, in their way of understanding the world, the very structure that is both spiritual and material of the entire cycle of manifestation of the world. I must admit that there are currents into Roman traditionalism that instead recognize the reconstructionist nature of their belief. But I mean, this is not the only one perspective, and in some way, it's not the most important, the most shared between practitioners. I would like to make a distinction in here, if I can go on with my. I think that we can really divide Roman traditionalism into three doctrinal areas and three periodization. I would like to briefly introduce them, starting from the historical taxonomy. I distinguish into Roman traditionalism among an embryonic period, a classical period, and a contemporary one. The first period goes from probably the second half of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th. In this early period, traditionalist contents emerged on the Italian cultural and public scene, and this was due to the work of some intellectuals, some artists, and also and even some scholars who were supposed to have contacts with traditionalist circles that remain until then in secrecy. And we can identify some crucial moments of this first period, the first era. First of all, the figure of the archaeologist Giacomo Boni, that was born in 1859 and died in 1925. That was the man, was a very nice guy who discovered the lapis niger, that the tradition want to be the burial place of Romulus himself. And this particular stone has an inscription with one of the oldest written evidence of the Latin language that is datable around 575, 550 before Christ. Boni's own archaeological research was highly influenced by his relation with the esoteric environment of its time. And for example, he attended the home of Emilina de Renzis, that was mother of Giovanni Antonio Colonna di Cesarò, who was a prominent anthroposophist, and was in correspondence with Leone Caetani, who was another key figure into Italian esotericism of that time. Then, a second very important fact for this first period is a writing of a play, a drama, by Ruggero Musmeci Ferrari Bravo, that was known as Ignis. Yeah, quite a weird name. Maybe due to this kind of particular name, he was known as Ignis.
Yeah, because nobody wanted to say it.
Yeah, nobody wanted to read it, and nobody was able to read it on the tablet, and so maybe Ignis is quite better. And this drama was entitled Rumon, Sacre Rome Origines. And Musmeci met another key figure, that was Evelino Leonardi, who was an exponent of the so-called Schola Italica. It was a sodalitium, Neo-Pythagorean sodalitium. And he himself did some studies on the divine proportion, and so taking a deeper interest in Pythagorean issues. And finally, there is, of course, the work of intellectuals such as Angelo Mazzoldi, or Ciro Spilandi, or Ignazio Ciampi. In particular, the work of Angelo Mazzoldi wrote Delle Origini Italiche, so it is about Italic origins. That's a work in which he argued that the prevailing opinion among scholars that was about considering Greece and Egypt as the very cradles of Western civilization, was in some way wrong, because this primacy had to be ascribed, in the words of Mazzoldi, to the ancient peoples who inhabited the Italian peninsula. And Mazzoldi went so far with his theories as to identify in ancient Italy none other than Atlantis, as was mentioned by Plato.
Was there any specific place in Italy, or
the entire? Because he was portraying a particular map of Italy that was bigger than the usual peninsula we're used to.
Okay.
With was larger, and then the water, the sea, submerged a very part of it, just leaving the figure of Italy we all know. And that's the way he said Atlantis was submerged by the sea, and the myth was about submerging a part of Italy. Also, I make instead coincide the classic period of Roman traditionalism, is the second period, with the years that passed from the emergence of a quite important reality that was the group of Ur, and the period led to 1974, that is the year of death of the philosopher Julius Evola, who was the first editor of the magazine Ur, and then Krur. There were two magazines tied to the group of Ur. By the way, Ur stands for fire or bull in Chaldean, or is, as a German root, stand for something like original, primeval, and prototypical. So the group of Ur was a quite composite esoteric association, because it welcomed a lot of personalities with very different backgrounds, such as Julius Evola himself, or Arturo Reghini, that was a Freemason and a follower of the Neo-Pythagoreanism of Rocco Armentano, the anthroposophist Giovanni Colazza, and these are just to name a few of them. So the group.
So what was the group of Ur, or the Ur group?
The Ur group was a magical sodalizium, because their main aim was to build together a magical chain that has two main targets. The first of these was to have an influence on the political scenario of Italy. And the second was to contribute with a magical chain to the spiritual uprising, to the spiritual development of every single member of the sodalizium. The group was in some way kind of a meteor, and was melting in a couple of years, but I think its legacy in the world of Roman traditionalism, and not also in Roman traditionalism, but in the whole esoteric scenario of Italy, was of very huge importance. I want to emphasize that the two magazines that were published in the group of Ur, then were titled Ur and then Krur, had very eclectic content, reflecting in some way the composition of the group. In fact, there are pieces by Plotinus and Iamblichus. They publish also the golden verses of Pythagoras, some alchemical texts, and some passages of the Majjhima Nikaya, a part of the first chapter of the Kularnava Tantra, and much, much more. And this was probably one of the most important experience into Roman tradition of this of the second.
What were they doing in the group of Ur?
There were, I think that the eclectic frame of the publications in some way reflects the kind of practices they were working on. To give some examples, Evola was really involved into a kind of practice that he assumed from both tantric sources, but adapting them to a kind of Roman general framework. There is a practice that is not described in nor in Ur or Krur, that is a kind of it's a meditation in which the practitioner has to act as he was the god is talking about and is evocating in some way. But for example, Giovanni Colazza has all another kind of practices, as he was the main disciple of Rudolf Steiner in Italy. So his practices was the one that anthroposophy is quite famous for. That are inner exercises and kind of meditational practices. And these were the very wide spectrum of practices inside the group of Ur. But what united them all was, as I told before, a will to influence the political scenario of Italy and to work together so that the chain work could improve their individual aesthetics. Yeah, this I think that are the main aims of the group of Ur.
And what about Julius Evola? There are lots of people that are interested in him or despise him. So he is kind of a polarizing figure, but definitely influential. So could you tell us more about him?
Yeah, I think that he was considered a philosopher, clearly in the terms of conservative revolution philosopher, and an esotericist, of course, but is quite more famous for his political ideas and for the influence he had on Italian extreme right after fascism. I think it's quite easy to dismiss Julius Evola as a kind of, how can I say, kind of bad master, an evil master, or the Black Baron, as it was called here in Italy. But I think it's a quite way because he was a more complex figure. I think that Evola attempted to resolve what he perceived as the very contradiction of idealism, and he tried to do so to reach this target by the construction of the notion of absolute individual.
Very Nietzschean.
Very Nietzschean, and I think also that this was somehow his very personal interpretation of the Hindu concept of Atman as a principle responsible for the whole manifestation. We have to remember two things. At first, that Evola started being a Dadaist, was a painter and artist into the Dada movement. And the second thing is that his thought was highly criticized, both from fascist intellectuals and from the Reich, from the German Reich. For example, Ugo Spirito, that was a prominent fascist scholar and intellectual, considered his doctrinal attempts to be very derivative and in some way megalomaniac. While on the second hand, many National Socialist Party officials suspected him of being actually against their pan-Germanic view. And of course, they were right, as Evola's idea was the one of an Italian supremacy. I think that what resulted was the scholar Staudenmayer described as a kind of magic idealism. That was is Staudenmayer that described it in this way: that's part tantric, part primitive Buddhism, part pagan, and part medieval alchemy. And I think it's a quite nice way to describe the idea of Julius Evola. There are some steps in his life that are fascinating and crucial.
Excuse me a second. We have a question. Do you know if Colin Wilson influenced by Evola, was influenced by Evola in regards to the issue of fascism?
Yeah, I think yeah, because Evola was in some way a figure. How to say, here in Italy, there are many associations, many groups that refer to the teachings and to the doctrine of Julius Evola. But I think that he has been more and more influential outside Italy. And this is due to the fact that it's quite difficult in Italy to take on a serious research about Julius Evola and about his ideas. There's a kind of social stigma against his ideas. And I think this is a problem, because studying a phenomenon obviously doesn't mean we have to adhere to that kind of thought, of course.
Yeah, I'm totally with you on that. I think that we need scholarship on absolutely everything, because knowledge is essential, even on things that we do not agree with. That's not, you don't just exclude from study and from research things that you don't agree with. That's not how knowledge works.
Yeah, and also, I think that as a scholar, I don't want to have the problem of justifying my studies, declaring in some way that I would not participate in that ideas. For a kind of methodological reason, I suppose to be not involved in ideas I've been studying, because I have a kind of methodological detachment from the object I study. And if I'm actually a scholar, I have to keep completely separate my positions, my personal position, that could be political, religious, or even generally social, from my area of research. But the thing is that in Italy it's still very difficult to go on a research about Julius Evola. And this is quite different. For example, the UK or also in the United States. I don't mean that there is no a kind of prejudice against Julius Evola, because it's present, of course, but many different thinkers have been highly influenced by Julius Evola, and they had a career. This is not an example of a scholar, but you can think of another very controversial figure, that is Alexander Dugin, that was very much influenced by Julius Evola thought. And I think that there are a bunch of books by Evola that are in some way crucial to understand his influence, both on the political frame and on the religious one. And the first is, of course, pagan imperialism. That is an adaptation of pamphlet with the same title by Arturo Reghini that Evola developed and published in 1928. Then The Myth of Blood, published in 1937, that was about his particular conception of spiritual racism. And I think also that the last work that has been highly influential is a pamphlet published in a journal that was called Imperium in 1950, and that was titled Orientamenti, that's guidelines. This particular publication was adopted by Ordine Nuovo, that is the New Order, that was one of the prominent extreme right parties, an extreme right organization, because it was before a cultural organization and then a political organization. And guidelines, Julius Evola guidelines, was adopted as an agenda of action by Ordine Nuovo. Ordine Nuovo was active from 1956 to 1969. And 1 year after the publication of guidelines, Julius Evola was arrested for being the theorist of an organization, of the extreme right organization called the Fasci di Azione Rivoluzionaria, FAR. And there was a peculiar defense of Julius Evola because he said and wrote that it was not his fault is if some guys decided to act in that way, because he never wrote anything that was in some way that's in some way to be considered as an inspiration for a violent action. So the debate was Julius Evola a bad master, or was Ordine Nuovo that was formed of very bad disciples? This is the main topic about his influence on the extreme right.
And what about the influence? Do you think that these right-wing thoughts that Julius Evola had have also influenced the Roman Reconstructivist movement that we have today?
You're asking about a contemporary phase of Roman traditionalism. I can say that Julius Evola is in some way more influential now than it was before. But contemporary Roman traditionalism is more articulated. We have very small groups, very small organizations, and a very big part of them still consider Julius Evola as a big influence, but there are also smaller groups that are trying to detach from this kind of past. Particularly, I've been talking with a lot of people from these groups that consider all the first and the second period, to use my distinction, to use this taxonomy, as a very problematic to legitimate Roman traditionalism in the public sphere. And so they are trying to developing different forms of traditionalism just interpreting the sources, the ancient sources, and leaving all this controversial past in the dust. Yeah.
I can think of one group in Rome that has that kind of approach.
Yeah. I'm mainly talking about groups in Rome. Yeah. Well, the problem of the relation between traditionalism and politics is that the Roman traditionalists tried a sacralization of politics. That implies a politicization of the sacred, necessarily. The relationship between politics and traditionalism is, in fact, is a constitutive feature of the whole phenomenon, at least in regards of the very early period and the classical one. As one of the first historical events that saw Roman traditionalism as a protagonist was the movement that advocated the intervention of Italy in the First World War. This war was really interpreted as a great Roman war that aimed to bring Italy back to what were perceived as its natural borders, and which are those defined by the Emperor Augustus, of course. And all the traditionalists of the first period were deeply convinced of the Italian intervention. In this context, in the particular context of the First World War, and then of the idea that the movement developed through the developing fascism, there is an episode on which still many perplexities are hanging for the few scholars interested in this issue. And that was, we were going to the Second World War, and someone decided to offer to Benito Mussolini fasces composed of a bronze axe that is thought to come from an Etruscan tomb, a very ancient Etruscan tomb, and are similar to some that are preserved in the Kircher Museum. And this axe was surrounded by 12 birch rods tied with red leather strips. And this was according to some traditional prescription. Since Mussolini was seen as a possible protector of the Romanization of Italy, some rites were celebrated to propitiate a more Roman Italian state. For example, celebration to propitiate the March on Rome in 1922 were celebrated, for example, the Cereris Mundus, the Ludus Troiae, also Ludi Palatini, Lupercalia. A lot of rites were celebrated in order to propitiate this kind of more Rome-inspired politics by Mussolini. But I think that this relation, the one of traditionalism and politics, as a black box. As a scholar and as an individual, I'm very much interested in the concept of black box as Bruno Latour described it. I think that a lot of, mainly all, social aggregates, social organization, as a kind of black box.
What do you mean?
Kind of a box of secrets. Mm. We know much, we have much information about Italian esotericism in the 20th century. But there is also a black box that gives us different information about that. And, I think that black box is constructed, it contains three kinds of different information. Some of them are original and so reliable. Some of them could be reliable, and some of them are false. A lot of scholarship about Italian esotericism and Roman traditionalism is based on these three kinds of documents. If we can go a little bit deeper into the black box, let me try an example. We all know the Red Brigades of Italy, le Brigate Rosse. That was one of the leading far-left militant associations that were responsible for violent incidents, and including the abduction and murder of the former Prime Minister, Aldo Moro, during the so-called Anni di Piombo, the years of lead in Italy. They were, in effect, kind of terroristic association. Well, some of the BR activities were planned and discussed in a center in Paris that was called Hyperion, that was supposed to be a language school, and was founded in 1977. But the center was then suspected of having relations with various far-left terrorist groups, but also with the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, and even Mossad. So even the right party had its hidden center beyond the Alps. Specifically, in Lugano, there was a villa on the lake near Lugano, with a very nice conference room and a beautiful fountain square in it. And this was named Villa Favorita. Villa Favorita was the one of Baron von Thyssen. And this very rich house was frequently visited by a man who, like Delfo Zorzi. Delfo Zorzi was one of the men in the Gladio, that was the Italian branch of Western Union Stay Behind organization, the one then directed by NATO and the Central Intelligence Agency too. Well, Villa Favorita was also frequently visited by very central names of Roman traditionalism. And it was in that particular circumstances that we can see particular relations between that kind of frame, the traditionalist frame of that period, and the political one.
How so?
Because at Villa Favorita intertwined some plots of the subversive right, but also there were magical environments and groups that would have been then close to very famous political parties in Italy. Because the political scenario in Italy was rapidly changing, was changing very fast. And after the dismissing of the Movimento Sociale Italiano, that was the main far-right parties after Fascism, different strategies were needed in order to gain some influence on the whole political frame in Italy. And that's the reason why also the attitude of some traditionalists, but I have to say that more than traditionalists meeting at Villa Favorita, we have to say that they were people into esotericism in a wider sense of Italian esotericism. The relation between esotericism and politics in Italy is very strong, has always been strong. And traditionalism is one of the shapes it took during its development.
So do you mean that even today, esotericism in Italy is linked strongly with politics?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Do you mean with right-wing politics or generally with politics?
Yeah. In some ways, nowadays, how can I say, the difference, the old dialectic between right and left into the esoteric field is more nuanced. Yeah. But yeah, it's a relation that is still alive, and I don't think that is how can I say, that in the past, in the early periods, was in some, or during fascism, it was stronger. It was more explicit.
I think that I would say that, for instance, a lot of pagans, contemporary pagans, I know that sometimes they are referred to as neo-pagans. They tend to be much more left-leaning.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So I was thinking about them.
Yeah, there is a small but interesting books that has been published in the frame of Roman traditionalism some years ago. Yeah, that is about the problem of contemporary paganism, and in that book, that kind of paganism, that is the one that we can describe as including heathenry, Wiccan, Neo-Celtic, Druidism, and so on, are considered to be a kind of aberration due to two main reasons. The one is that Roman traditionalism conceived the personal, do not consider the personal choice of religion, because they say that spirituality is not a matter of individual choice, but is tied to history, that is, ancestors, and to the place where you live. Italy is called by Roman traditionalists as Saturniatellus, the place where Satan, the god Satan, lived and still is in the underground. This presence, this divine presence, permeates the entire land, and through the land permeates all its inhabitants. So the fact that a lot of people into contemporary paganisms that are different from the Roman traditionalism, of course, have decided their faith, their spiritual participation, is considered to be kind of modern approach. And in this point, we can see a very interesting echo of Julius Evola's thought, because in Roman traditionalism, there is a strong emphasis on the critic of modern world, the critic of its values, its way of life, its political ideas, its economical directions.
So is it a search for a golden age in the past?
Yeah, I think that they have in some way the deep conviction that this has to happen. we are going, and this is another echo of the Hindu thought, because they think that we are at the end of the Kali Yuga, or the Iron Age, to say in with a more traditionalist Roman traditional lexicon, and this will necessarily lead to a new golden age. What they're, or at least a big part of them, and mainly from the very first, the early organization and groups, what they've been working for is to keep that kind of flame alive.
So if you were to narrow down the main traits of the Roman traditionalism, what would they be? So the first one would be like the refusal of modernity and aspects of modernity, because they want to go back to this ideal, right? And what would be the others?
But as I mentioned before, I make a further distinction in three doctrinal areas, which is what makes Renato Del Ponte, that is the founder of the MTR, the Movimento Tradizionale Romano, Roman Traditionalist Movement, and one of the main group of the contemporary era. The first group, the first area, which we may define as conservative, has set the goal of revering the Roman religion that flourished between the origins of Rome and the Punic Wars. And they are inspired by the so-called scriptores rerum rusticarum, that are the authors of old things. For example, Varro, Virgil, or Cato the Elder. The second area focuses on the precision with which rituals were performed, taken from ancient sources. To make another parallel with the Hindu world, we can say that this second area is what in Vedanta is Purvamimamsa, with their attention to the details, to every detail of the ritual. And finally, the third component was very interested in mysteriosophical and metaphysical contents that are more or less absent from the first and the second area. So incorporating elements of Neoplatonism, mainly of Plotinus, Proclus, and Iamblichus, among others. As in this area, I think that all the three components are in some way deeply convinced of the return of a golden age, but they have different ways to help this happen. And I think that is in the third component, the one more interested in mysteriosophical aspects of the ancient religions, that we can find a lot of different, a lot of influences coming from different esoteric fields that develop in time. So we can find practices coming from the work of Kremmerz that had a very big influence on the Roman traditionalist milieu.
What was the influence of Giuliano Kremmerz on the aesthetic milieu?
I think that Kremmerz, mainly through the idea of the Osirian Egyptian order. Do you think it's necessary to introduce the figure of Kremmerz?
Just briefly, so that we can.
Yeah, it was born in Naples, and he started his own esoteric corpus after he met the Freemason Giustiniano Lebano, and Leone Caetani. We've been briefly talking about him before. He edited some esoteric journals like The Secret World, Il Mondo Segreto, or The Hermetic Medicine, and the later Commentarium. And then he established an occult order of his own, known as the Fraternity of Miriam. Many scholars, even that many refer to this field is in some way very optimistic, think of a link between Miriam and the so-called Ordine Osiride-Egizia, that is, Osiridian Egyptian order, that was quite mysterious esoteric order in that time. But there is a big misunderstanding this idea, because that specific order that we refer to as Ordine Osiride-Egizio has never really emerged in the public sphere, as it simply was not interested in any form of proselytism. But despite this confidentiality, I had the chance to read their Historia Ordinis, that is the history of the order, and I wasn't really able to find any reference to member of the Miriamic academias, neither anyone linked in some ways to Kremmerz. Of course, Kremmerz wasn't on that list. But it's through this particular esoteric field that the works of Kremmerz, the particular magical path of Kremmerz, influenced other traditionalists that were, we have to think to Italian esotericism of that time, not structured on different boxes, but it was a kind of, there's a flux in it. It was a kind of ocean of different ideas, anyone influencing the others.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you. We have a question. How do Roman Reconstructivists express their religion in the modern day? So how does, what does Roman Reconstructivists look like today?
Yeah, thank you for this question, because it's very interesting. I think there are two ways they express themselves. We have a conservative wing that is in some way getting older, but some new members are joining that kind of conservative traditionalism. And then we have different groups trying to develop, as we said before, a different way to intend traditionalism. There are many social network pages about Roman traditionalism. You can obviously imagine the reaction to that kind of phenomenon into the conservative sector of traditionalism. And many of them are practicing rituals as they can read in the ancient sources, where there are no notes on particular parts of the rituals. Many of them simply create them.
I think Ovid is quite popular.
Yeah. Yeah. But many, the older members and some younger members that are in some way that had the idea of staying true to the principles, are still practicing those particular rituals and celebration that developed during the Evola period. That so were very particular. There are also, there is a nice story about a Roman practice that has to be transmitted to one of the main group, the one that preceded the MTR, that was the group of the Oscuri. And there are legends running in the field about this particular practice that they say was sent to the group, to the Dioscuri group, by a bishop, saying that the practice was in the Vatican Library. I know that this ritual is still used, is still practiced.
Interesting. Thank you for the super sticker. And can we hear an example ritual? I know a group in Rome that has a YouTube channel, and they have some of those rituals. They post some of those rituals, and the name of the group is Comunitas Populi Romani. I'm gonna write in the chat.
And is the leftish group of the
Yes.
Yeah.
Let me write in the chat. Do you know other examples, Marco, of rituals that contemporary reconstructionists would do?
It's quite easy to find the rituals of a group that is called Pietas.
And
I think that the ritual, if you have contact with them, of course you have to contact them in some way, but are in some way public. Yeah. But there are many of these rituals that are still private, because the idea is that the public cult is no more possible, of course, because there is not the political institution that in some way legitimate what was the public cult in ancient Rome. So just the private cult, and this is in the ideas of conservative traditionalists, just and simply the private cult could be performed. So they practice in their houses and just in their strict groups.
And what kind of reconstructionism do you think that is more popular or more widespread in Italy nowadays?
I think that in quantitative terms, I think that the most the proper reconstructivist forms of practice is the most widespread. But talking about the intensity of social ties and cultural links, the conservative forms of practicing are probably stronger in their in the way they shape mutual relations and group dynamics.
I see. Thank you, Marco. I think that we can wrap up our conversation now, because I've held you hostage for over an hour.
And I was very happy with that.
Is there anything else that you want to add, or you feel that people should know about the Roman traditionalism or the Roman Reconstructivist movement, so that they can have a better understanding about it?
No, I think that even if it's not so easy to find interesting academic books or papers about Roman traditionalism, I would like to suggest that when researching into Italian esotericism, but it's not, of course, not only about Italian esotericism and traditionalism, we have to pay a lot of attention to the black box. There is a lot more into the black box. and it's quite interesting to find.
Is it like the Schrodinger's cat?
Yeah.
Every time that you say black box, I think about Schrodinger's cat, and I think, is this tradition dead or alive?
Dead or alive, yeah, of course.
Or maybe both.
Maybe both, yeah.
So yeah, thank you so much. And
Thank you very much, Angela.
Hank has just joined. Thank you, Hank. And if you guys have further questions, please leave them in the comments, and Marco and I will look at the comments and reply whenever we can. But thank you again, Marco. It was lovely having you here, and I hope you enjoyed having this conversation.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed a lot, and I really hope we could cross our roads again.
Yes, and definitely we need to meet in person as well.
Yeah.
So, and last thing, if people want to find you, are you on social media at all? Is there a way people can find you?
This is a very paradoxical feature of my life, because I am a sociologist, and maybe for this reason I have no social at all, but I have, of course, a mail. Is it possible to send it in the chat?
Yes, if you are on YouTube. Otherwise, I can put it in the info box if you want.
Okay, it's marco.castagnettoalessio at unito.it.
Yeah.
I'm sure you will be able to write it, and so to let the people who want to get in touch.
Yes, I will put it in the info box.
Okay.
And thank you, Frater RC, for the super chat. So thank you again, Marco, and thank you everybody.
Thank you very much.
And thank you everybody who has attended this conversation, and to those who will watch it afterwards. And if you enjoy this conversation, please don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell so that you will never miss a new upload from me. And if you can help at all, and you want to support this project, because this is a crowd-funded project, I would really appreciate it if you consider supporting my work by joining my Patreon with one-off PayPal donations, or by joining memberships that you find next to the subscribe button. And otherwise, thank you all for the super chats and for being here and for being amazing. And stay tuned for all the academic fun. Mwah. Bye for now.